Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, John Mickton, and Dan is still traveling and look forward. We're going to see him very soon as he comes back from his travels. Just as we are already in the thick of 2025, I think one of the things that many of us have done very likely in January, we were doing all these New Year's resolutions and thinking of all the things that we're not going to do or we're going to start to do. And now that we are in end of February, early March, I think it's so appropriate now to kind of think about what lies ahead. And we've had many different guests on all kinds of topics. But one thing I think we haven't really done is kind of future introspection. What does the future hold? What does the future have in store? What are some of the patterns and the disruptions that might come into play? And I know as school leaders and educators, we'll always have strategic plans, and the strategic plans are trying to look at what are some of the disruptions and how do you mitigate them? How do you plan for them? How do you structure curriculum, learning, and also managing communities of learners as parents, students, and teachers. So all these things are really important. And today I'm very excited because we have reached out to the Simons Institute, who are based in Geneva, Switzerland, and they work on strategic initiatives. And their co-CEO, Max Stauffer, who is the one that founded it with his partner, Konrad, who are the two co-CEOs, have been doing a lot of work as a nonprofit organization supporting global cooperation, really to look at large-scale challenges. They provide policy advice and facilitate decision-making on technology governance, global risks, and long-term planning. And since 2021, the Simons Institute has contributed to many international processes and policies and organized workshops, and they delivered a UN report on existential threats, really focusing on what are some of the multilateral actions that you can do to improve technology governance, and more important, what kind of policies can you engage with that consider the future generations? In other words, in the case, our students. Max has been a senior policy officer at Geneva Science-Policy Interface, also a visiting fellow at the UN University and co-president and head of policy research at Effective Altruism. And so it's such a pleasure and an honor to have Max here today. Warm welcome, Max, to the International Schools Podcast.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me, I gave a bit of a bout. I think for a lot of our audience, educators and international school leaders and international school educators, they very likely don't come across the type of work and organizations that you do. And why did you start this? What is kind of your vision you and Konrad have built around this? Because you're working with governments and a lot of non-governmental organizations like the United Nations, for example. Tell us a bit about the vision of the Simons Institute.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks again for having me. So Konrad and I are best friends, right? So we studied international relations together at the University of Geneva. And when we met back in the day, we started another organization which tried to help young professionals and students find good careers that have a high social impact. And in that process, we had a lot of reflections on our own careers and what we care about in this world. And I think as a result of some values, some worries we had with respect to technological advancements and an interest in institutions and global governance, we thought that something was missing in the international system, which was an organization that would look quite far in time to then reverse engineer actions that governments and international organizations can do today to help current generations, but also kind of safeguard the agency of future generations. And so we could have decided with all of these thoughts to take a job in a government or to take a job at the UN, right? But we thought that if we were to do that, we would probably lose ourselves as individuals in bureaucracies, and we would not be able to live up to our standards and values. And so we decided to build the Simon Institute, which is a vessel um, to stand for these values, to stand for these causes, and build that vessel as a flagship in the international system, as a signpost for diplomats, for governments, that this is something of importance and something that we can grow, and that is ultimately independent of Konrad or my brain at some point.
So that idea of long-termism, and one of the things about your organizations, and if you go to their website, and Max has been very kind and put the website up, so do go and pop over there and look at some of the work that they're doing. You talk about these existential threats, or yeah, they're actually called existential risks. And maybe talk about what you, as your institute, have identified those are for, let's think about educators and students and international school leaders and educators. What might be something that they should be mindful of about these two?
Right. Great. So maybe like one thing I can say just like on existential threats in general, and then and maybe then I want to counter what I will say, and maybe correct a little bit what we have on the website. So just on existential threat, the way we understand this is that those are threats that, if they manifest, would lead to loss of life on this planet, or a potential lock-in scenario in a very bad negative equilibrium. And there are very few things that can cause such bad events, right? But it so happens that with the advances in technology, humans have developed the ability to affect themselves and the environment on the very large time scales and space. And I think the first thing that really comes to mind maybe would be pandemics. And like a Black Death back in the day would like eradicate like a third of the global population. Nowadays, a pandemic, if it is engineered, would not have the same trade-off between how deadly it is and how virulent it is. And so it is plausible that such a pandemic could spread very quickly and be also very deadly, leading to a wipeout of like a large, very, very large part of the population. And so like we don't necessarily feel the same risk of pandemics as before. Now this risk is more acute. Another example would be nuclear risk, which is exchanges between nuclear weapons. If it escalates, it can lead to a nuclear winter, which is a scenario where the planet is surrounded by a cloud following the nuclear exchange, which can then lead to food insecurity and the death of like probably 5 billion people. And so like there's one thread that we just see, which is the most existential threats are man-made. They're created by human activity. And the one that we're primarily preoccupied by at the moment at the Simon Institute is existential threats from artificial intelligence, and especially advanced artificial intelligence. And I think here it can take many different forms. I think one thing that people tend to talk about is in societies that become more and more productive, people tend to have more free time, right? And with AI systems deployed in the economy, we might just have humans that have more free time in their life. And that begs the question of what do they do with this free time? And a lot of us, including myself, including you, John, I'm sure, derive meaning from work, right? From like doing a job that rewards us with something that we care about. What if we have much less of this? And what if, as a result, like we just lose something that provides our life with meaning, and we just end up with vast mental health issues? I think that's like one scenario at scale that people talk about. I think what we are worried about as well is more like irreversible consequences if you develop advanced AI systems in which you encode values that are not universal, and then you deploy those systems at scale, say in surveillance systems, in business customer interactions, in education systems, in maybe in trading systems, and then you cannot unplug, right? Like you cannot tell nowadays people not to use the internet. It's likely that you cannot tell at some point people not to automate things. And if you started automating things in a way that is not well representative or not well controllable, then I think we have a big issue. And so we're trying to prevent that.
And so it's so interesting because you highlight in the three scenarios of you talked about the pandemic and then the nuclear winter and now AI, advanced AI, is that the fact that human beings are behind these existential threats, which is really interesting that you're not identifying existential threats that are non-human related, like, say, for example, sun flares or something like that. And so one of the things that I know that in your website and the work that you do, you talk about this idea of long-termism. So this is if we're not familiar with the term, I just assume long-termism has to do is you're trying to plan long-term. But I'm sure there's more complexity to that. Why are you looking at these existential threats and then also thinking of long-termism as a way you can support the organizations that you work with?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I think long-termism, the way we see it, is more of an ethical framework. It's more like a part in our value system. And the way I would define it is that long-termism makes us value future generations, unborn people, the same way as we value current people. Um, and the reason why we have this intuition, at least, is that um, we probably intuitively care about our family and maybe our neighbors. But if we really think about it, um, we also care about people that are far in space on the other side of the planet. Maybe people that are far in terms of gender differences, in terms of sexual differences, in terms of ethnicity or culture. And so all of those are dimensions that are not relevant to discriminate against people. And so we think that time is not a relevant dimension. So whether someone is born tomorrow, in 10 days, or in 1 year, or in 100 years, that doesn't change the fact that those people have moral value, that those are people that we should be caring about. So we see long-termism as more like a reason to care, and rather than a planning element. And actually, I think a lot of people who think about long-term risks and future generations tend to plan for the long term. And actually, we don't do that. The way we work is that we care a lot about long-term scenarios, but we think that urgent action is very, very important and probably more important than planning for the long term. And so most of our work is defined on a 3 or 6 months timeline, because change needs to happen now if we want to prevent those existential threats.
When you talk about the 3 to 6 month timeline, is that just because things are moving so fast, or is it just because you're being realistic that if you plan for beyond 6 months, then you're kind of, you're going to be out of touch because things will have changed so much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's for two reasons. One is the speed of technological development goes really fast. So, for example, in AI, the emergence of AI capabilities, whether it's like text recognition, image recognition, creation of a speech, or the emergence of automated agents, those capabilities depend on how much compute is used. We know that there's a fourfold increase of compute usage in developing those models per year. And that has led to tremendous developments in AI in the last 5 years. And that will probably continue in the next 5 years. And so technology is extremely fast. If we are not agile, we will miss the mark. We cannot commit to long-term plans because they will necessarily be irrelevant. That's one reason. The other reason is because we work at the intersection of science and technology and policy or governance. And so the impact we can have is highly dependent on whether there are windows of opportunity that we can leverage to convert scientific knowledge into policy change. And so those windows of opportunity tend to be sudden, a bit erratic. So typically it's after the publication of ChatGPT that at the global level, AI negotiations started, which made us pivot on AI. Before that, we didn't have windows of opportunity to make progress, so we did not pivot to AI. So that's why we're kind of responsive and agile.
So, if I'm thinking about the way you're approaching this with the agility and understanding that sometimes when there's a disruption, there is an opportunity to pivot and engage with it. If we think, and you have worked at universities and you're involved also with academics and higher education institutions, schools by nature are super cautious because you're dealing with human beings. You can't just pivot that quickly when you're dealing with 400 or 500 students and teachers, especially when you have students from as young as 3 and old as 18. Is there something you think schools should start rethinking when they think about strategic plans? Because many schools used to do 10-year strategic plans, then they went to 5, and now they're 3. But if we go by your understanding, it seems that a 3-year strategic plan might not be the good idea. Just some thoughts about how realistically is it for an academic institution like a school that has kids 3 to 12 be so agile to pivot and have strategic plans that are no longer than 6 months?
Right. So I think a school can afford planning for a longer time period than we do. And I think it's because the school has a different theory of change, has a different theory of impact in the world. And in part because it's a numbers game. You know how many kids will come, you know how many graduate, you more or less know what makes people pass exams. So like there's a lot of data on what works in terms of schooling. So you can draw from a lot of history and then kind of update your plans according to what works and what doesn't. And there are a lot of studies in education that you can draw from. In our case, there are no studies on how to create policy change on technology, like some qualitative theoretical things, but it's not a science. So I think that's one key difference. I think there is maybe more like in the substance of those strategies for schools that I would change. So I would like orient the strategies of schools in a way that focuses on making children or young adults like a lot more agile in today's environment. And I think today's school system doesn't do that. Um, and for example, my co-founder Konrad dropped out from his degree, and his last degree is a high school diploma. Yet he performs extremely well in a tech and policy environment, and probably better than many diplomats and government officials that have plenty of degrees. And I think that's because he's built this agility. So like I would focus on that primarily. I'm happy to bring some ideas on why.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. So, I mean, and we talk about, schools and agility and adaptive intelligence, and those are very popular. If you look at a lot of business leaders, they talk about being an agile business and being an agile school. Agility is requires a capacity to change quite quickly and change multiple times. By nature, schools are really not set up for that. So I'm curious, as you saying that, schools should be focusing on this agility. What are some things that you would want schools to consider and invite them to think about, especially when you're thinking about children?
mm, yeah, so I think the first thing that I would change is the focus on knowledge or information that schools have so much. I think this is potentially one of the biggest bottlenecks in education that I see, where essentially schooling is seen as, in traditional terms, teachers that teach information to kids that are recipient of that information, which are then evaluated based on whether they understand, remember, and maybe like reproduce the information that was taught to them. And I think that that's ultimately highly problematic for many reasons. The first one is that um, it creates this thing where like kids are evaluated based on what they know and not based on what they do, which I think later on makes them a lot more risk averse in the face of uncertainty. In the face of technology and policy change, there's no way you know something. Everything is very uncertain and chaotic. So your performance will depend on your ability to do something despite the risk of failing and then learning from mistakes. But I think in school with exams and etc., like we're trained to like really learn before doing. And I would try to reverse that. Can schools kind of send kids out there to try to do things and nurture real world feedback loops to learn from them? And I think some schools try to do that, but I think the norm is very information based. I think that's one thing in part. Another part is more like what are useful things to learn? Because at the end of the day, schooling is about learning, and I generally don't think that like general knowledge or like general cultural knowledge or so or general information is that useful because I don't think those are kind of general capabilities that then the kids can use as they grow up. I would rather want kids to think about what do they care about? What do they value? And how do they break down this question? And can we give them tools on like, oh, what do I value? Like, oh, my parents make me value these things and maybe this cat at home and the elderly and family, but that's a tradition. Do I value traditions? Why do I value traditions? And maybe like those form of thinking, I think that helps a lot. I see a lot of people around me, my age, that have a very implicit motivation structure. They ultimately don't know what they care about. It seems they just go with some flow. And I think that's not so good. It's subject to ideologies that can be toxic, and it makes people, I think, a lot less empowered because they don't know what they're fighting for.
And it's interesting you bring up this issue of if you don't, if it's implicit, then you feel less empowered. And, if you think of the education systems that we're in, the reason knowledge works is because you have a whole host of teachers that have been trained and taught, and their workflows are really designed around this knowledge acquisition. And then in whatever country you're in, there usually is some final exam that's kind of your ticket, exit ticket from K-12 education. And there are many different permutations of it. Of course, it's not all exam based, but I would say in international schools, we're very exam driven as the exit ticket to show value. What is your value added proposition as you've had some good results? Now, how do you think schools have to navigate that if the people that are running the schools and teaching, their structures are based on that model? How do you suddenly say, sorry, that's not going to work anymore?
I mean, I think in any institution, whether it's a policy one or education one, um, what you find inside the institution beyond tables and chairs is just people, right? So whether they are school leaders or teachers, those are just people. And I think what you would expect from this collection of people is most of them to be like somewhat like cogs in the machine, like they fulfill their function the way it was designed for them. They fit the role they applied for, or they feel the rule book on what to do as a leader or as a teacher. Very much fine. It's very important. Otherwise, the school will not work and it creates stability. It's the same in policy. Like we need bureaucrats to do their work. Otherwise, it's not going to function. But I think what you find is that like there are often like 1 to 3% of like leaders that are a bit more entrepreneurial in their thinking, and they not only feel the urge to change things, but they're also quite strategic and tactical with the way they can change things, and they leverage the right timing and the right people to actually push changes through what otherwise is a very inertia-prone institution. And I think I would not make a recommendation to all school leaders and teachers. I would rather find this like 1 to 3% leaders that feel very empowered to create that change, and then give them tools and inspiration to do more.
Yeah, and I think that's so important is to have those tools. And also, it's interesting how you're saying is maybe start with a small, distinct group that can kind of model that, and then long term people can see that. Now, when you mentioned bureaucrats and also how, with bureaucracies, there's often inertia. How is it you're a very young organization, and as I understand, most of you are under definitely 40, that's for sure, and maybe even 30. How is it when you go and sit in a room with UN bureaucrats and UN policymakers that often might be a couple generations? What are some of the strategies that you find you're seeing in intergenerational understanding of these risks?
Yeah. So we indeed young. I'm 30 years old, for example. And I think one thing that I must say is that um, gender and having a beard make a lot of difference. So I do look older than I am, and I think being a man just makes many things easier, unfortunately. And I think we've seen this reality so many times that uh, the world is very unequal in terms of perceptions and how much people are given the benefit of the doubt. And so for some reason, people tend to trust us a lot. I think what has helped a lot Konrad and me is that we are two people. And so people see that the Simon Institute is not a one-man show. It's not a turbulent, crazy person that is trying to do something for their own interest. They see a friendship, or they see two minds that disagree as well, and they can disagree openly. And I think that creates some form of trust because there's more than just one person with some interests. And I think that works at any level of generation. But because we're young, I think that gave us credibility and trust earlier. Um, Another element is that a lot of people in the international system are idealists. And they became diplomat and they became international civil servant because they care about the world and they take a global perspective. However, the idealists, yet they are fatigued and tired, and they are borderline nihilistic with respect to how much change can happen. So I think they're extremely happy when young people come in and provide kind of fresh perspectives. And I think that's what we heard many times is that like without us, some ideas won't be shared. And so it's very important to have outsiders or young people in there to change things. I think like maybe another element is that we decided to be honest, and I think there's an incentive to be dishonest when you work in policy because you feel like everything is political, everything is a perception game, and I think some actors decide to directly manipulate. Some actors decide to lie in order to influence more. And we thought, taking a longer term perspective, that like this would actually be bad for us and for the organization in the long term. So we've built this brand that is very frank and honest. And I think in a system that's prone to inertia, people value frankness and honesty, especially when everybody has a script and there's a statement to say, and we don't, and we get to just improvise when we go to a meeting or to an event. And I think that's just valued because it's different.
And that, as you're describing this disposition that you bring to these conversations and working with international civil servants and this idea of generation and you coming in with more of an improvisation attitude, kind of more off the cuff, but being very honest and frank. How do you think schools could leverage this with their own students? Because I'm thinking, in international schools and schools in general, there is this term of student agency, student voice. Super popular, and a lot of school missions will talk about student voice, student centric, but the realities sometimes are very different. From your experience, even working with, because you work more in the higher ed space, but if you think of schools, what could they maybe shift and to make sure there's more of those voices from different generations at the big table, if you want to call it that?
Right. So so I think in general, people um, take themselves very seriously and take things not seriously enough. And I would want them to do the exact opposite. So I would want people to learn how to take things in the world very seriously, to actually care a lot about global issues, to care a lot about impact, even if it's hard, and to care about what they say, to care about words and language. And simultaneously, I would want them to take themselves a lot less seriously and to just detach themselves from ego or from insecurity or from some perception from outsiders on like who they are and what it means if they're on a global stage, because those things don't really matter. Who cares? And so I would want schools to go much deeper in like helping kids and young adults like doing introspection, and introspection in letting go some form of ego and self-judgment, and then training again like what do we value as human beings. I'm saying this because I think I've seen young people like um, not wanting to engage in certain conversations because of insecurity or stress, or they sometimes decide to over prepare, and they're reluctant to improvise because they don't want to make a mistake. But making a mistake sometimes is the best thing to do, because then you can recover from it and show that. If you don't make mistakes, you cannot show the recovery. And so to me, it's again like action before information. Um, and that's, yeah, that seems very important. I think maybe a practical example is I've played improv theater for like 5 years or so, and I think schools should have improv theater classes. And and maybe it should not be called improv theater. It should just be let's simulate realities, be in them and learn from them, and have just more and more simulated settings rather than being very cerebral about it.
It's interesting as you talking about being more introspective and giving opportunities where we're not worried about the ego and the self, but thinking more about the collective and some of the bitter realities that surround us. If you look at the way, and we were talking about AI at the beginning here, how algorithms really curate our whole mental health and our mental interests, and a lot of it is all about being me. And so, do you find that this is something as you're working, that this is a challenge that you face often? Is this kind of very self-centered, egotistical, all about me? I'm going to worry about how I look and how I sound more than thinking about the bigger moment?
Somewhat. I think, yeah, I think there's a paradox that we're seeing at the moment, which is a mix where people resort more to individualism. And I think it's in the face of uncertainty, risk, instability, you want to preserve what's certain, which is your existence from your perspective. That makes a lot of sense in a way. Um, but I think like what you see simultaneously is that like young people date less. Young people have, I think they go party less. And I think there's a general tendency to like regress in terms of like deciding to enjoy life And I think like that is paradoxical if like you have an increase in individualism at the same time. But I think the fact that we have both simultaneously is quite problematic. If people were more focused on themselves and trying to live very, very happy lives, then I would be fine. But what I see is something a lot more grim, which is more like an isolation in a bit of a dark room, a trajectory. And so I would want, yeah, like schools to kind of break out of that and foster maybe alternative scenarios and thinking on this. I think when it comes to technology, I mean, there are different studies showing whether or not technologies are responsible for it. I think it's a mix. Technologies might make people a lot more stimulated just on their own and on their smartphone without necessarily needing to interact with others. But I also think it's a question of like the state of the world and also maybe how excited people are to have kids nowadays, and therefore how well do they educate their kids and take care of them instead of putting them in front of laptops and tablets. So,
When you say about people being more introspective, worrying about the self, and this paradox that you talk about, wanting to be either maybe risk averse or hesitant to engage and make mistakes, do you think these existential threats of that you were talking of AI and maybe the environment, do you think those are making it much more challenging to be positive?
mm, I I think so. So yes and no. Yes, because on the one hand, in the recent years, people across the board have become a lot more aware of uh, the problems that we face in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's a war with the war in Ukraine, um, whether it's pandemics with COVID-19. So I think there's a more visceral sentiment that the world is not very good. um, I think there's that, but I think at the same time, there's not a very good sentiment of how much worse it can be. I don't think the existential threats are actually well understood and taken seriously. So I think it's more like there's a level of worry which is quite quite heavy, but the level of worry is not necessarily on like the most negative things that may happen. And interestingly, like I think that's why if you come to the Simon Institute, you can hear us talk about the most existential threats to humanity, but you will still hear us be happy, having a positive outlook on life, trying to be excited about things and be like up and running and quite jumpy. And that also does not necessarily make sense. But I think it's in a way because like we worry about such deep things that makes us also like value life more. And I think that so I think that's one thing. Then there's a thing that we're trying to work on, which is it's not just about the risks and the threats. Let's be honest. I think if we talk about institutions, if we talk about technologies, there are like drastic upsides and positive scenarios that we could be talking about. And sadly, because of a negativity bias, we tend not to talk too much about them. But imagine a world where you have personalized education via AI systems, a world where you have a lot of free time and you can do what you want and learn tons of things. A world where you can alternate between real world and virtual scenarios whenever you want. A world where cancer is cured. Like there are many, many examples where technology can and will yield to like extremely positive scenarios. And I think like we also don't grasp how good the upsides can be. Just like we don't grasp how bad the negative threats are. So I would want kids to kind of, or like young adults, maybe not at the kids level, to like grasp the variance between those scenarios, and that like this is basically where we're going.
Do you think it's because bad news sells better than good news?
Most likely, yeah, most likely.
Because I think it's really interesting you bring up the point. If you think of some of the technology changes, and you even with cancer, you're hearing many, many reports in just the general press about how many advances and new drugs are being put onto the market. And I just think that's such a really important point you bring up, is that we really also need to focus and celebrate the positives, the values of these things that are coming along, especially with technological advances. Max, if you were in a room full of 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds and they're about to go and sit an exam, whatever exam it might be, and it's an exam for to get to university, or it's the next phase in their career, maybe they need the exam then to go and do a vocational training or whatever. What would you want them to be thinking about beyond the exam? Because the exam's going to be their focus. But what would you want though that room of kids to think about beyond the exam? What should they maybe consider?
Mm. So I think I would practically or metaphorically give them a blank page and say, write or draw or compose the world scenario that you're most excited about for like you and your close ones. And what does this look like? And why do you want that to happen? I think I would want them to like to draw this or to like represent that on that piece of paper. Um, and yeah, see what comes out of it. I think that's the first phase. A second phase would be um, like mix up and find others that have gone through a similar exercise and compare notes. And like, where do you agree or disagree with your peers? And why? And then assemble one piece together based on what you have on your two one pages. Um, and then meet another pair and do that again. And I think what I'm trying to get across here is like, can we get this population, so like 18 years olds, to think for themselves about what can be really exciting in the future, and then make sense of that collectively to then rebuild the collective picture. Um, and I trust that it's possible, but I think it almost never happens that this thing is run with this population. So yeah, I would do that.
I love the idea of the blank page. It's almost as you were saying, you do improv. That's just like a improv, right? It's like a blank page. And what was really nice is the way you framed it as something positive, because often we might kind of veer more to what is the reality. So, no, I love that. And then I love also the fact that afterwards they're coming together in pairs and looking for common ground. I think so often we don't give people blank pages, especially kids. So often I know when I teach adults and in some of the activities we do, we ask them to draw, and it's amazing. And you give them colored pens, and they just really get into it because they haven't drawn on a blank page for decades. And so I think that's just a really nice exercise that you shared with us. Thank you. Max, this has been an amazing conversation, and it's so many deep, rich ideas that you've shared and perspectives that I think are so important for us to kind of reflect upon. One thing we do as we wrap up the podcast, we ask for you to invite our audience to consider something. You have education leaders and educators, and I don't know if it's the same thing or each group is different, but what would you invite them to consider as they think of 2025 and 26? Because so many things are changing, and who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But we know, especially in technology, the changes have been phenomenal. So, what would you want to invite our audience to consider here for 25, 26? I'm putting you on the spot, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would. Mm, I would want them to engage with the following thought. Um, the I think there's a decent chance that the world is going to look very absurd in the next years. And absurd in a way because there will be more US isolation. There's more emergence of like other powers that are not Western. The international system will have a different flavor. And at the same time, there will be the emergence of extremely powerful and relatable technologies that will have a Western American flavor to them, such as the current Chat GPT and others, but like extended forms of that. Um, and I think like that will give some weird sense to people because it will be like the world is so interdependent, so complex, that we're playing this game between those like extremely positive scenarios and extremely negative scenarios. And I would kind of ask them, like, given this reality, are you motivated enough to create change? Or are you dropping the ball? And if you're dropping the ball, why? And what can you do to remain motivated? Um, I think that seems to be like a core question I would be asking myself like this year, next year. Very often, like we think that the most important thing that needs to happen in the world is actually impossible to create. And I think that's precisely the point to try is that we need to defy the odds. And so I would want people to be mentally ready to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Max. That's wonderful. I just want to remind our audience that you can go to the simonsinstitute.ch and learn more about the organization, Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance, here in Geneva, Switzerland. And Max, thank you so much for the time and the wisdom and the perspectives you've shared. It's just been so nice to hear this because so often we don't get to interact with people that are working on policy and working with large non-governmental organizations like the United Nations and governments and higher education institutions. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I want to thank our audience as always. We have more people following us on LinkedIn, and we so appreciate your comments and all the feedback that you're giving, and also just being faithful listeners. Thank you so much. And Max, thank you. And maybe in 2026, we'll come back and see what has come up in that crystal ball that you shared so nicely. Thank you so much, Max, for being on the podcast. Thank you to our audience. We'll see you next time.